Snow fell so thick it swallowed sound. In the Ardennes forest, December 1944, American soldiers strained their ears in the white silence, listening for engines they could not see. Somewhere beyond the trees, German armor was moving, but the forest, the fog, and the low cloud ceiling hid everything. Overhead, the sky pressed down like a lid. On frozen airfields across Belgium and France, hundreds of Allied aircraft sat ready. Engines were primed, pilots waited in cockpits, breath fogging the glass. But they could not take off, the weather would not allow it. For years, Allied air power had dominated the battlefield. Bombers shattered supply lines, fighters hunted anything that moved. It was the Allies' greatest advantage. Now it was gone. The Germans had chosen this moment carefully. They attacked not just through the Ardennes, but through the clouds themselves. Snow and fog became their camouflage. Low visibility became their shield. Men on the ground fought blind. Convoys stalled on icy roads. Wounded waited hours, sometimes days, for evacuation that could not come. And yet, far from the frozen forests and burning villages, another kind of battle was already underway. In quiet rooms filled with maps, charts, and pencils, a handful of men were staring not at the front lines, but at the sky. They believed the weather would change, not eventually, not someday, but on a specific morning, at a specific hour. And if they were right, the enemy's greatest advantage would vanish as suddenly as it appeared. The German offensive did not begin with a roar. It began in silence. Before dawn on December 16th, 1944, artillery erupted across the Ardennes, its flashes swallowed almost instantly by fog and falling snow. Shells burst in forests where visibility barely reached 100 yards. Roads vanished beneath ice. Sound carried strangely, sometimes too far, sometimes not at all. For American units holding the line, the attack felt unreal. Enemy. Movements were sensed more than seen. Orders came late. Messages arrived garbled or not at all. Men fired into white space, unsure if anything was there. This was not how the war was supposed to be fought. Allied planning had always rested on one assumption: air superiority would reveal the enemy, slow him, break him apart before he could move far. But the Ardennes winter erased that advantage completely. Low cloud ceilings pinned aircraft to the ground. Fog turned reconnaissance useless. Snowstorms rolled in one after another, each one sealing the battlefield tighter. German columns advanced beneath that cover, tanks, infantry, fuel trucks moving through forests the Allies believed impassable in winter. The weather hid their buildup, masked their movement, and blunted Allied reaction at every step. The shock was psychological as much as tactical. Commanders who had grown used to seeing the battlefield from the air were suddenly blind. Reports conflicted, maps no longer matched. Reality. Units were cut off before anyone realized they were in danger. The enemy seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, and the longer the clouds held, the worse it became. Every hour without air support meant more pressure on the ground, more roadblocks falling, more towns surrounded, more men fighting without knowing what waited beyond the next tree line. The German gamble was working, not because they were stronger, but because the sky had turned against the Allies. And as long as it stayed that way, the offensive would continue to grow, hidden, protected, unstoppable. On airfields across northern France and Belgium, power sat idle. Rows of fighters and bombers waited on frozen concrete, wings dusted with snow, metal creaking in the cold. Ground crews worked with numb fingers, clearing ice, checking engines, preparing for missions that never came. Pilots waited too. Some sat in cockpits for hours, engines off, staring at a gray ceiling that refused to lift. Others paced hangars, listening for updates that always sounded the same. Low clouds, poor visibility, no takeoffs. For the Allies, this was more than frustration. It was paralysis. Air power was not a supporting arm. It was the backbone of Allied warfare. It was how offensives were shaped before infantry ever moved, how enemy columns were spotted, tracked, and broken apart long before they reached the front. Now, that backbone was locked in place. Without reconnaissance flights, commanders had no clear picture of what lay ahead. Without fighter cover, supply convoys risked ambush on narrow forest roads. Without bombers, German assembly areas and fuel dumps remained untouched, hidden beneath cloud and snow. On the ground, the consequences were immediate. Medical evacuations slowed to a crawl. Wounded men waited in makeshift aid stations as roads iced over and aircraft stayed grounded. Ammunition resupply fell behind schedule. Fuel shortages spread. Units that depended on rapid movement found themselves stuck, exposed, and increasingly isolated. The weather did not simply delay Allied operations, it reshaped them. Battles became close, confused, and personal. Instead of airstrikes and coordinated advances, fighting collapsed into small unit actions in forests and villages, where visibility was measured in yards and reaction time in seconds. German forces understood this terrain. They moved deliberately, using the weather as cover, knowing Allied aircraft could not see them, could not stop them, could not even find them. Each day the clouds remained unbroken, the imbalance grew. For Allied commanders, the sky became something to watch obsessively. Every forecast briefing mattered, every rumor of clearing weather raised hope, and every failed prediction crushed it again. Because everyone understood the same truth. The moment the aircraft returned, the battle would change. Until then, the giants of Allied air power remained grounded, silent, witnesses to a fight they were built to dominate, but could not yet enter. While the front lines froze in confusion, another war was being fought far from the snow-covered forests. It took place in quiet rooms, windowless, crowded with maps, chalkboards, and long tables covered in paper. There were no weapons here, no medals to be won. Just men studying numbers, symbols, and shifting patterns that never stayed still. They were meteorologists. In most wars, intelligence meant intercepted messages or enemy troop movements. In the winter of 1944, intelligence meant something far more elusive, understanding the atmosphere itself. Every decision depended on them. A forecast determined whether bombers would launch or stay grounded, whether fighters could escort supply convoys, whether airborne resupply was possible or suicidal. A single error could send aircraft into icing conditions, tear formations apart, or waste fuel that could not be replaced. And unlike other forms of intelligence, weather offered no certainty. There were no enemy documents to capture, no prisoners to interrogate, only fragments, scattered observations from distant stations, ships at sea, isolated airfields, and men reporting what they saw when they looked up. Each report arrived late, incomplete, sometimes wrong. The atmosphere over Europe was vast, chaotic, and indifferent. Storm systems formed over the Atlantic days earlier, then collided, split, or vanished without warning. Cold fronts slipped south. Pressure dropped, then rose again. Everything moved constantly. The meteorologist's task was not to control any of it, but to understand it faster than the enemy. German forecasters watched the sky too, but their reach was shorter, their data thinner. Their predictions often limited to the next day, sometimes only hours ahead. The Allies were trying something different. They were attempting to see the weather as a system, stretching from North America to Europe, believing that if they could understand where storms were born, they could predict where they would die. It was an audacious idea, because if they were wrong, the cost would not be embarrassment or paperwork. It would be lost aircraft, lost crews, lost opportunities that might never return. And yet, in the middle of the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, these men were being asked to do more than predict tomorrow. They were being asked to decide when the war itself could move again. There were no satellites, no computer models, no instant global data feeds. Weather forecasting in 1944 was a discipline balanced between science and intuition, built on patience, experience, and educated risk. Everything the meteorologists knew came from scattered points, isolated observations stitched together by hand. Reports arrived by radio and telegraph from weather stations across the Atlantic world, from Greenland and Iceland, from the British Isles, from ships braving the North Atlantic, crews measuring wind, pressure, and temperature as waves crashed over their decks. Each report was a single pinprick of truth in a massive moving system. By the time those observations reached headquarters, they were already old. Hours had passed, storms had shifted, fronts had bent or accelerated. The meteorologists had to imagine what the weather was doing now, not what it had done earlier. They spread maps across long tables. They marked pressure systems with pencils. They traced fronts by hand, watching how they curved, where they weakened, where they collided. Over time, patterns began to emerge, not certainties but tendencies. The work demanded judgment. One forecaster might see a pressure rise and expect clearing skies. Another might see the same data and predict renewed snowfall. There was no final authority to settle the argument, only experience and the consequences that followed. The strain was constant. Forecasts had to be delivered on schedule, even when confidence was low. Commanders wanted answers that did not exist. Pilots wanted guarantees that could not be given. The atmosphere did not care about deadlines, and winter made everything worse. Cold air masses stalled and lingered, storm systems slowed, then stacked on top of one another. Visibility dropped unpredictably. Icing conditions formed suddenly, turning routine flights into death traps. Every forecast carried weight. Send bombers too early, and they might scatter in cloud, lose formation, or crash into unseen terrain. Delay too long, and the enemy would continue to move freely beneath cover. So the meteorologists learned to read subtle signs. A slight pressure change over the Atlantic, a shift in wind direction hours away from the front, the slow weakening of a storm system that had dominated the continent for days. These were not dramatic signals. They did not announce themselves. But to trained eyes, they suggested possibility. And in the winter of 1944, possibility was everything. Because somewhere within the chaos of charts and pencil marks, a fragile opening was beginning to take shape, one that could decide when the Allies would finally reclaim the sky. The first sign was not dramatic. There was no sudden clearing, no break in the clouds, no sunlight pushing through the gray. Instead, it appeared quietly, on paper, numbers shifting just enough to make experienced eyes pause. Pressure was rising, not quickly, not evenly, but steadily across stations far to the west. Reports from the Atlantic hinted that the storm system dominating Europe was beginning to weaken. The flow of cold air feeding it was slowing. The balance was changing. To anyone else, it meant nothing. To the meteorologists, it meant everything. They leaned over maps, pencils hovering, retracing lines they had drawn dozens of times before. They compared fresh reports with older ones, looking for consistency. A single reading could be an error. Two might be coincidence, but when the same pattern appeared again and again, across distance and time, it demanded attention. Winds were shifting slightly to the northwest. Cloud ceilings, though still low, were no longer falling. Temperatures aloft suggested instability, conditions that sometimes preceded clearing. Sometimes. That word mattered. Winter weather did not obey clean rules. Storms could stall unexpectedly. Fronts could collapse, then reform stronger than before. Forecasting a clearing was one of the most dangerous calls a meteorologist could make, because clearing skies did not arrive gently. They arrived unevenly, patches of visibility opening and closing, turbulence ripping through cloud layers, icing forming where it was least expected. Aircraft sent up too early might find only chaos. Inside the forecasting rooms, debate intensified. Some argued the pattern was real, that the storm's grip was loosening, that the atmosphere was preparing to shift eastward, opening a narrow window of flyable weather. Others urged caution. They had seen false signals before. They knew how often hope distorted interpretation. They reminded everyone what was at stake. But the data kept coming. Each new report added weight to the same conclusion. The pressure rise continued. The storm weakened incrementally. Not enough to end the winter, but enough to suggest a break, a brief one, a fragile one, and if it came, it would not last long. The question was no longer whether the weather might change. It was whether anyone would dare to act before it did. Forecasts did not win battles on their own. They had to be believed. The prediction moved upward slowly, carried not by confidence, but by caution. From forecasting desks to senior weather officers, from there to operational planners, and finally to commanders who had learned, through bitter experience, what happened when the sky was trusted too easily. The message was carefully worded. Not a promise, not certainty. A window, a narrow period, measured in hours when cloud ceilings might lift high enough for aircraft to operate, when visibility might improve just enough for fighters and bombers to find their targets, when air power might finally return to the battlefield. Every word mattered, too strong, and it would sound reckless, too cautious, and it would be ignored entirely. Commanders understood what was being asked of them. Preparing air operations took time. Aircraft had to be fueled, bombs loaded, crews briefed, routes planned. If they waited until the weather clearly improved, it would already be too late. The opportunity, if it existed at all, would close before the first engines ever started. But if they acted too soon, the cost could be catastrophic. Aircraft lost to icing, formations scattered in cloud, crews flying blind into terrain or unseen enemy fire. In winter conditions, mistakes were unforgiving, so the decision hovered in an uneasy space, between action and restraint. On one side was paralysis, the certainty of continued German movement beneath cloud cover. On the other was risk, the possibility of committing air power into conditions that could destroy it. The forecast offered only probability. But probability was all war ever had. Orders began to take shape. Air units were told to prepare. Crews were placed on standby. Flight plans were drafted, then redrafted, adjusted again and again as new reports arrived. Nothing was launched yet, but everything was ready. Across airfields, the atmosphere shifted. Pilots sensed it before they were told. Briefings grew more specific. Ground crews worked longer hours. Engines were run and shut down, tested again, kept warm against the cold. Everyone waited on the same thing, not a command, not a signal flare, but the sky itself. Because once the decision was made, there would be no turning back. The aircraft would launch, or they would remain grounded, watching. History passed beneath the clouds. The change came quietly, not with sunshine or warmth or the sudden end of winter, but with subtle movement overhead. The cloud ceiling began to lift, almost imperceptibly at first. Fog thinned in uneven patches. Gray gave way to lighter gray. For men who had been staring at the sky for days, it was unmistakable. Across Allied airfields, the waiting ended. Engines coughed to life in the cold morning air. Propellers bit into frost-laced wind. Ground crews moved faster now, urgency replacing routine. Pilots climbed into cockpits, pulling gloves tight, scanning the horizon where the clouds no longer felt quite so close. The weather was not perfect, but it was flyable. One by one, aircraft lifted from frozen runways, climbing cautiously through broken layers of cloud. Some flights hit turbulence, others emerged into thin bands of sunlight, visibility stretching farther with every mile. For the first time since the offensive began, the Allies could see again. Below them, the battlefield revealed itself. Roads packed with vehicles, columns stretched along forest routes, supply trucks, artillery, tanks, movements that had been invisible now lay exposed. What had felt like chaos from the ground resolved into patterns from the air. Targets appeared where none had existed before. Radio traffic surged as pilots reported what they saw. Coordinates were passed, routes adjusted mid-flight. The machine of Allied air power, silent for days, roared back to life in a matter of hours. On the ground, soldiers felt the change before they fully understood it. The distant sound of engines returned, not enemy armor, but friendly aircraft overhead. The psychological weight of the clouds lifted with them. Men looked up as fighters streaked across gaps in the sky, proof that the battlefield was no longer sealed shut. The sky had not cleared completely, but it had cleared enough. And in war, enough was all that was required for everything to change. Once the clouds lifted, there was no hesitation. Allied aircraft struck with speed and coordination built from years of practice that had been waiting for this exact moment. Fighters swept ahead, clearing the skies. Bombers followed, heavy with ordnance that had sat untouched for days. What the weather had hidden, the air now revealed. German columns stretched along narrow roads, packed tightly by forest and snow. Vehicles that had moved freely under cloud cover were suddenly trapped in the open. Fuel trucks burned. Artillery positions were spotted and hit. Bridges, already strained by ice and traffic, collapsed under repeated attacks. The effect was immediate and devastating. The offensive had relied on momentum, on speed, on the belief that Allied air power would remain grounded long enough for German forces to break through and force a decision on the ground. That belief evaporated in hours. Pilots returned from their first sorties with Reports that confirmed what commanders feared and hoped in equal measure. The enemy was exposed everywhere. Follow-up missions launched almost immediately. Strikes overlapped, pressure never eased. From above, the battlefield transformed. What had been a confusing, fragmented struggle became a series of identifiable targets. Supply lines were severed, reinforcements were delayed or destroyed before reaching the front. Units that had advanced confidently under cover now found themselves pinned, burning, or retreating. For German troops, the reversal was brutal. The same weather that had protected their advance now betrayed it. Roads became death traps. Open ground offered no concealment. The initiative slipped away with every passing hour. On the ground, Allied soldiers felt the difference unmistakably. Attacks slowed, resistance weakened, enemy movements became hesitant, cautious, uncertain. The pressure that had felt overwhelming days earlier began to lift, not all at once, but steadily. The battle had not ended, but its direction had changed. And that change did not come from a new weapon, or fresh reinforcements, or a brilliant maneuver on the ground. It came from the moment the sky turned against those who had depended on it most. As the German offensive faltered and began to collapse, attention shifted back to the front lines. Infantry pushed forward, armor regained momentum, towns that had been surrounded were relieved, one by one. The story of the Battle of the Bulge returned to familiar images, soldiers advancing through snow, burned-out vehicles lining the roads, the slow grind toward victory. But far from the headlines, the men who had helped make that reversal possible faded quietly into the background. The meteorologists did not move with the advancing troops. They did not fly the missions they enabled. When the weather stabilized and the skies remained open, their work simply became routine again. Briefings delivered, charts updated, forecasts filed. There were no celebrations for a correct prediction, no visible marker of success, yet the weight they carried during those critical days lingered. They understood, perhaps better than anyone, how narrow the margin had been. A few hours' difference, a misread signal, a storm that lingered longer than expected. Any one of those could have changed the outcome. Instead, the gamble had paid off, not because the weather became kind, but because it became understood. The men who studied the sky returned to anonymity, their role absorbed into the machinery of war, their names rarely recorded alongside the battles they influenced. But from that winter forward, something had shifted. Commanders no longer saw weather as background noise, no longer treated forecasts as educated guesses to be acknowledged and ignored. They had learned in the forests of the Ardennes that the atmosphere itself could be studied, anticipated, and, at the right moment, used. Victory had many architects. Some carried rifles, some flew aircraft, and some never left the map room at all. After the fighting moved east and the Ardennes faded behind the lines, the lessons of that winter did not. They followed the war forward. In planning rooms and headquarters across Europe, weather forecasting was no longer treated as a background consideration, something to be worked around or endured. It had proven itself a decisive factor, capable of shaping entire campaigns when understood and trusted. Forecasting units were expanded. Data networks grew wider, procedures changed. Commanders began asking not just what forces they had available, but when the sky would allow them to be used. The atmosphere had become part of the battlefield. In the decades that followed, that lesson only deepened. Satellites would replace scattered observations. Computers would model systems that once had to be imagined by hand. But the foundation remained the same as it had been in 1944, recognizing that weather was not random noise, but a force with patterns, limits, and opportunities. The Battle of the Bulge is remembered for courage in frozen forests, for endurance against overwhelming odds, for a desperate gamble that failed. Less often remembered is this, that the turning point came not from firepower alone, but from patience, from men willing to trust careful observation over fear, from the decision to act when the signs finally aligned. The enemy that could not be shot had been understood, and once it was, the balance of the battle shifted. If you found this story worth remembering, consider sharing your thoughts below, especially if you've come across other quiet roles that helped shape the outcome of the war. Sometimes history is changed not by what we fight, but by what we learn to see.